I'm Ben Siegel. I'm the race engineer on the number 45 car driven by Christian Lundgaard, and today on Tech Tuesday we're going to talk about race strategy. So to get started for a race weekend, we have to consider several different factors, right? You have to worry about what tire options you have available, how many sets of each tire you're going to have. You got to look at how many potential stops that might be in a race, which also factors into how much fuel you're going to use, and then back again to the tires that you're going to have. And primarily that feeds into what happens in a practice session or in a qualifying session, the strategy you might use in qualifying to try to get through the race and put yourself in the best position that you're going to have. Some of the factors that also play into that will be in qualifying, which round of qualifying you make it to. If you make it to the Fast Six, then you're going to have less tires available that are fresh than someone who didn't make it to the later rounds.
Yeah, I mean, ideally it already starts from practice one, how many tires you use in practice one. The rookies obviously have an extra set of tires for practice one, or really whenever they want to use it throughout the weekend, which helps them.
Yep.
But yeah.
So the way we'll kind of get started is we'll look at the options that we'll have. We'll look at what potentially was successful the year before or in years previous. You kind of factor in, say if it's a street course race and it's the same tire at every street course, how have the other street course races played out as it leads up into the one that you're looking at, and then kind of look at your strengths and weaknesses as well as like what do you think is going to play out for you, and then you constantly kind of review that through the weekend and look and see what's working, what's not working, what do we think is going to work well for other people versus where we can sort of take advantage of that, and what do we want to stay away from. And if you qualify well, you might focus kind of primarily on one strategy. If you don't qualify well and you've got a lot of options available, then you're kind of looking at what's going to give you the best ability to move forward in the race. So
I guess it comes back to the which percentage do you have highest of winning a race, or which one gives you the highest percentage of finishing in the top 10, taking the safe option or taking the slightly more bulky option of, okay, we know that there's a low chance of this working, we need a caution at a certain point in the race, but let's try it, we got nothing to lose. These kind of things, obviously, it depends if you're, for example, as we were in Toronto, we were on pole, we know that the car is fast enough to pull a gap, and that was the strategy in the end, try to pull a gap as much as we can in the first stint, and then kind of see how it plays out after that, because we can build the advantage early on. We had a long caution in the beginning, which only helped us because we were able to run longer on those tires, which we actually didn't do because we ended up pitting on the lap we were planning on to do anyway. But that's all the factors that goes into the discussion pre-race. And obviously, if you believe one strategy is the faster in terms of tire choice, you might bring all three cars on there, or you might just do two or even one, depending on whether you qualify. But I think it's likely to see that the top six in a race that goes to the Fast Six, all of them will start on reds, the softer compounds.
Or at least have a similar approach most of the time.
Exactly.
You might have one or two that choose to do sort of the alternate strategy, we'll call it sometimes.
Yeah.
So how do you get started looking into those types of things? The factors that go into those will be, what do you expect your tire deg to be like that? So, how many
qualifying
seconds?
Position.
Your qualifying position. The tire deg is basically to determine as, how many seconds a lap are you going to lose relative to, the lap before, basically, and factor out how long you think a set of tires will last in a race, how long you can go on fuel, which is obviously impacted by how fast you're going. Qualifying pace is going to be typically considerably faster than what a race pace is, and so you're going to use more fuel in qualifying than you will in the race. So you're starting to try to balance that out and look at all those factors in combination. So before the weekend starts, we've had probably several conversations amongst various people about what we think might happen. Probably talked with the drivers a little bit about sort of what they're thinking, what their preference is, what their feeling is. How does the car react currently, and what we're thinking about for this particular weekend, and then certainly the type of track, whether it's an oval, street course, road course, it all plays into it. So we'll start weighing all that, kind of come up with a general scheme of what we think will happen or what we're prepared for to happen. But you always kind of have to have some contingency plans of, okay, well, what if this happens? How do we react to that? What if this happens? What do we react to that? And a couple times this year, there were some unique situations that were playing out where the typical strategy in the past may have been one thing, and it's kind of like, well, if it doesn't go the way that we're thinking, then it may actually play out this way. And one interesting scenario this year was St. Pete. We took 3 sets of red tires in the first round of qualifying because there was a yellow that happened in the middle of qualifying that allowed us, basically to get one more lap, which we wouldn't have wanted to do, but really in that situation we were kind of forced to do it.
Yeah, I mean it comes back to you're guaranteed not transferring, or you can put this set on and then hope you transfer. And we actually ended up being the second fastest car on that round, but then we only used tires for the rest of the qualifying. Right. Going into the race as well. Obviously, you have to keep one sticker set for the race, where some other people didn't use those 3 sets, and they had 2 sticker sets for the race, which ended up being the preferred tire for the race.
So then you get into the race weekend, and you've already kind of defined, we're going to use this many sets, like Christian just mentioned. You're going to have one fresh set of reds for the race. You're going to have whatever you have left, effectively, of black and red tires from there. So if you've qualified well, like we mentioned before, you have less new reds available to you than you would if you didn't qualify as well. So as you work through each practice session, you're kind of defining how many sets of tires do we want for this. Are we carrying over a set from the previous session to start on, and then do new runs sort of later in the session when the track is maybe a little bit better. And then putting yourself in a position for qualifying to be prepared for how many laps are we going to do on a set of tires. Are we going to do 2 reds or a black and a red, or only try to get through on blacks is a strategy that happens sometimes.
I guess what's fun about this is it all starts from practice 1. It all starts pre-event. You come into practice 1. Do you decide to do a lot of Q sims in practice 1, potentially use two set of tires that's only going to put you in deficit for the rest of the weekend, or are you going to do one long run and then kind of scrap the idea of doing a quali 1 in practice 1, which we've done on occasions, and try to save as many tires and yet get as much information at the same time, because the practice time is very limited. Tires are very limited. You always run into, we want more tires. But I guess it all comes down to how many tires you have, and the amount of stuff you can try in terms of changes on the car, fuel strategy in practice 1, and then you're suddenly into qualifying, and then it's qualifying mode, and then you jump into warm up, and now it's just race. But what have we learned? Where are we with tires? What have we learned throughout practice that we can use, but yet not having used as many tires as we really wanted to, because in the end it's all tires.
Yeah, and there's definitely situations where what happens through there, you may have planned one thing, but something else ends up playing out, where, say, you flat spot a set of tires that you had meant to be, say, a lightly used set that you were potentially using in the race, and then for whatever reason gets flat spotted, or you run off track a little bit, and now you have to kind of rebalance your race plan because of that.
We had that exact situation in Laguna.
Yep.
We started on a new set of sticker blacks and ended up puncturing the tire on the first lap. So we kind of used that sticker set in the beginning of the race, but didn't get any benefit of it, and had to run used for the rest of the race, which ended up turning out to be a black race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you get through qualifying. You now know what your qualifying position is going to be. You know kind of what you are going to have left for tires. Typically, you still have a warm-up session that you have to get through, where you're going to use a couple of sets of tires potentially in there to try to learn what the tire deg is, what your fuel savings might be, and kind of what the actual race pace of the car probably is, and where you stack it versus your competitors. So then, before the race, we're hopefully dialing down into from what we thought before a race, what we've learned through the weekend, or before the event, what we've learned through the weekend, where we are now, and hopefully just ironing out the little details of what we're planning to do, which lap we're probably going to stop on, which tires we're going to take in which order. Might have an A, B, C, D, E, F strategy depending on what's going on,
or a no plan.
And in some cases you might have a little bit of a, hey, we're gonna look at every opportunity that pops up as you go along the way to try to decide what's going to give us the best opportunity to move forward. So come up with a plan before race, kind of agree with it, agree with the driver, and agree with everyone that's involved on what the plan is, and then hopefully put the plan into action and win the race.
So Ben, now we've covered the pre-event stuff. Now I want to ask you the question, how do we make decisions in race? Obviously I'm in the car, and how do I influence that, and how does that influence the decision made on the stand?
Conveniently, we've got an example of a place you might like, which is Toronto, right here. It went pretty successfully for us this year. So this is a good example because there's a couple of typical things that might potentially happen during a race, and they all kind of happen at different points through this race in Toronto. So if you're ready, we can take a step through that.
Let's dial it in.
Let's do it. Okay, so as we discussed, we've talked about start tire selection, and in this case, we've got some examples of who selected which tire to start the race, and then also what they selected when they made their stops for the remainder of the race. We've got a layout here that in this case shows the finishing order. We've got some highlights on where the race went yellow at different times, how many laps they did on a stint. We've got an example of the track layout, and then if this was playing through the race, you'd see the cars moving around the track, which we've got paused for the moment. We've got a running order,
which is also a good point. So basically, this line, I'm guessing, means where if I pit, where I would come out.
That's exactly what it means.
Okay.
So we've got a reference that's on here that shows us. Say you're leading the race in this case, we know that when you pit, you're going to come out potentially in that position, plus or minus a little bit of margin. If we have a really, really good stop, we're obviously going to come out ahead of that. If we have something that slows us down in the pit lane, then we're going to come out potentially behind that. So we'll look at history, we'll look at what's gone on in the practice sessions leading up to that to come up with what the delta is that we think, and then we put that in the software here, and it shows us what that's going to be. That's something that will kind of update throughout the race if we see that our expectations are a little bit different than what's happening in reality. Then we'll update that to be more accurate. But there's a lot that can factor into that, and it's actually a really important number to have a good handle on, because let's say the race pace changes a lot. You're going way faster than what we anticipated, and now the pit loss is different than what we expected. Or let's say the whole field goes into a fuel savings strategy, and now the pace is slowed way down. When you actually make a pit, then it's going to change where that comes out. Right?
Yeah, so all of this is being kind of dialed in.
To keep up on it live.
Doing the race.
Yeah.
But if I don't know if we want to start with just the two obvious yellow lines that is crossing the screen here.
Yeah, so this was an example at the start of the race. As you'll remember, there was
and as I mentioned
a bit
earlier,
of a pile up.
Yeah, which was a lot longer yellow than I wanted it to be, even though that it only helped our strategy really and our plan. The good thing is here we see the lap numbers here at the top, and we pitted on lap 18. And if I'm not mistaken, I think our plan was to pit on lap 17, but it was to build a gap in the beginning of the race, push us hard, use push to pass at the certain areas that we knew were beneficial for lap time, pull the gap, pit. Obviously, the yellow in the beginning of the race only helped us for that, because we were able to save tires, we were able to actually go longer. And I remember being very irritated in the car because I knew I had a lot more tires in on the car that we could have used and potentially even gone longer. And try to see if we could have extended the gap even further and potentially even further overcut the people that were behind us.
So an interesting point on that is, as you mentioned, going longer in that case. Couple of factors there. One, we got the yellow that maybe we didn't really want, but in that case, how can we benefit from it? Okay,
exactly.
Now we can go longer than what we maybe say originally planned. But that said, if you're still planning to pit on the same lap, then now you have the ability to push even harder than you say you would have if you were planning to run 18 laps, right? As the race plays out here, if you look at the cars that started on the red tires, which here is shown in green because it was a street course.
Yep.
Right? What you'll see is a lot of the cars that started on the red tire actually pitted about that time. So everybody was kind of thinking
in the
similar strategy, right? What you have to be careful about in those cases is that you have a car that's on the red tires that pits early, comes out in clean air. They're able to run very quick and potentially quicker than what you might be able to run if you're in traffic or something. And so those people can undercut you in that case. So that's why a lot of times you'll see clustering like that where everybody kind of comes in together. And so as the leader in our case, no one was in front of us. We're not in traffic. We're kind of managing the pace. You're managing the pace as you see, and we've got a general target in mind, and we're looking for, okay, at what point do we start to lose time to the cars that have already pitted? At what point is the gap starting to close up to us? Are you starting to struggle with tire fall off at all? And we're trying to stay very on top of what that is, because a lap, one way or the other, can really make the difference sometimes.
But I guess it also varies and depends on which position you're in. Because obviously if you're leading the race, then you want to take a slightly safer choice than if you're 10th in the race and potentially trying to push for an undercut to even undercut maybe 5 cars into P5. So I get that aspect of it. I've always wanted to ask you this question in terms of why did we pit that lap, because there was more in it.
It's a secret.
Yeah, okay.
But it's an interesting point that you can make, and it's kind of a fun thing to go back and look through, old races and look at, not just us, but why did anybody make the decisions they make in the situation that they're in? Because there's always something to be learned. So we make our first stop here, as you can see.
Running nice and smooth.
Running nice and smoothly.
Front tires.
And as you look, here is another example of a graph that shows us what the time delta is between each car. So we're the kind of reference line here, and you'll see the rest of the field. And anything that's going down is kind of we're pulling away from that group. Anything where they're coming up, they're either catching us or we're sort of falling back to them. However you want to sort of view that. So in this case, we've got no one in front of us. We're pulling a gap. We're ready to pit. We pit and come out here in between a couple of cars. McLaughlin's now leading the race, and you'll see that his pace stayed pretty similar. We weren't really gaining or losing relative to him. He wasn't pulling away from us, which was a little bit of a concern in that case with us coming out in traffic. But we were able to work through traffic here relatively well and end up in a gap towards the end of the stint where we're able to start to close up on the cars that are ahead of us, and that really helps when you come to the next cycle of pit stops, right?
Yes.
So as this race plays out, those are the things that we're kind of focused on, is what's happening with us, what's happening with the people that what we call who are we racing, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, yes, we're mixed in with a couple of cars, but we're racing them to try to get through the traffic, but we're really focused on the guys that started, or the other cars that started with us earlier in the race. So in this case, McLaughlin, Pillow, or Dixon, I think it was in this case.
Which can be very confusing for the everyday racing fan, because they see one guy leading the race, then they check their telephone, and then they check the TV again, and then suddenly the guy that was leading the race is down in 18th, and they wonder, okay, what happened to him? Yeah. But ideally, obviously, for us, we know that we've pitted. We're still racing the guy then who's suddenly in P2, because we are just waiting for him to pit to see where he comes out and where we are relative to them. But obviously, it all comes down to, are you trying to protect your position, or are you trying to attack? Obviously, in this position, we were trying to protect where we were, not losing, hopefully gaining even more on them. But we were on two different strategies. We started on the softer compound, they started on the harder. So they were able to run longer, and we've already done our pit stop at this point, so we are vulnerable for a yellow at this point, which ended up happening not long after.
So, yeah, in this case, on the screen. So in this case, what you saw happen was, what the finishing order was. For McLaughlin here, McLaughlin started on the primary tire, the black tire, and went 34 laps before he pitted. We went 18 laps and then went to that same tire. So for a portion of this, we're all running basically the same tire, which is a little bit nice for us because we're not at risk of a car on a potentially faster tire for a short window, eating away at the time gain that we potentially have. But then you get into this portion later where that car does pit, they do go to the red tire. We're still on maybe the slower over the stint tire. And at that point, you're at a little bit of a risk. And when you get here, luckily what we saw is that we were able to maintain the pace relatively well. So that was good and that was encouraging. But then all of a sudden we get a yellow, which in this case wasn't really what we wanted when we wanted it.
No.
Ultimately. So
I think that the two yellows there were in that part of the race was really not the time that we wanted.
Right.
The yellow.
So in this particular case, it's a good example of, sort of not necessarily what can go wrong, but what can happen that's outside of your control that you have to be able to react to and process and make a decision based on. So in this case,
make the correct decision.
Make the right decision.
Yep.
So at this case, we're on a set of tires. We're expecting to make one more stop in the race. This caution's a little bit too early to really want to take it now, because if we do, we're going to have to save a lot of fuel to potentially make it to the end of the race. But if there's a lot of caution between now and the end of the race, then it could potentially work out for you, right? So it's a little bit of one of those, do you take the risk to be the first to the last stop and have the ability to stay out from that point on, or do you wait, get a potentially better caution, allows you to not have to save as much fuel or save any fuel, be on the better tire, vice versa. So as a situation like this plays out, it's stressful when you're leading the pack because you don't want to make the wrong decision.
Yep.
Like you said, there's a situation there where you're trying to weigh out, sort of what's the least risky. If we take a little bit of a risk, how bad is it? What's the potential downside to it? And in some cases like this, you're talking to the driver as well, not just the group that's on the timing stand or support people that you have, but talking with the driver as well to try to say, hey, do you think you can do this? Like we think the math works out potentially. Do you feel comfortable with this strategy, and try to get some feedback there?
Yeah, I do remember this certain situation of we were on a long stint, and unfortunately I'd flat spotted both my front tires trying to get through some of the traffic after our first stop, and I wasn't necessarily struggling with it. The balance of the car wasn't disturbed by it, but I had a lot of vibrations on the straight, and I remember it actually getting better towards the end of the stint. But obviously this yellow comes out, and I'm trying to feed information to the team in terms of what is the car balance. Do I need a pit? Do I feel comfortable to do this restart on these tires that have now done, 20 laps, odd 20 laps at that point, and then take the risk of having to run potentially 40 laps for the end of the race on a similar set.
Yeah.
At the end of the race, some people took it, but you don't really know. I mean, you can be the ballsy one and do it, and then hope that either a lot of yellow continues for the rest of the race, or that it's a straight race where you just have track position because it's a street circuit. It's a benefit of being in the front of the pack because you're less likely to overtake because of a street circuit. So you're trying to weigh all of these things in, and I'm in the car, adrenaline is pumping, and obviously I don't want to give up my position, but in the end you got to think about the long game. What benefits us the most? Do we want to do like everybody else and play the safe choice, or obviously I don't see all the numbers, which sometimes I wish I do because I want to have a say. The only thing I have a say in is what is the car really doing, and how I think I can do on fuel management in terms of for the rest of the race and so on. I mean, I'm going to be asked the question, do you think you can make this number? And then the answer is either yes or no.
Yeah,
or maybe.
And typically, we have some understanding ahead of time of what do we think is reasonable. But you might get a situation like this where that's a little bit beyond the range that maybe you've explored up to that point, and you say, how easy was it to get this number before? What's the pace like now? Maybe the pace has slowed down to where that's a little bit easier of a target than what we say expected or what we'd planned for. And so you need a little bit of back and forth there to try to decide, does this potential strategy make sense? In this case, there were a couple of cars that decided to take that yellow. We decided not to. And then as it all worked out, there was another yellow.
As the restart.
Right as the restart was.
Of that caution.
There was another yellow, and at that point it's like, okay, now we're in a place where we feel like we have to do this now. Interestingly, there was a couple cars that chose not to take that one and go even longer. So
comes back to do you want to risk that 1% of this might win us the race because we're on a complete different strategy, or do you go down, okay, we're actually in the window, everybody's taking this, or do you want to be the different one?
Yeah.
And some people didn't turn out so well for them.
So in this case, we chose to take the second caution. We restarted, I think, fifth in line, maybe sixth in line. We're able to get around some traffic pretty quickly, which was cool. Ended up catching up to Pilot, who in this case had a broken front wing. There were still 3 cars that had to pit that were at the front who had stayed out in that case. So what you ended up here was a group that was kind of in the middle that took it. They cycle down to the bottom. Then you have the next group that takes that caution. They cycle back through, and then you got the third group that stayed out for all 3. And now they're going to cycle back to the bottom when it all works out. And ultimately, we were able to pass the cars we needed to pass to be, effectively back in second of the cars that are on our strategy.
Yep.
So Pilot was kind of the lead car of our strategy at that time.
Who ended up being one of the drivers that took the first yellow.
Which is
interesting because, so I ended up winning the race. We had the second yellow, and the second and third place car pitted on the first yellow. So we knew that we were better on fuel than them by almost 3 or 4 laps, I think. And our pace was good enough, I think, on straight pace to beat them, but you never know. And that's, again, the risk that you have to weigh. Do you want to be like everybody else, or do you want to try to do something else?
Yeah. So now we catch up to Pelot, we get around him, and now we're just pulling off into the finish, as you can see on this chart, where everybody's kind of fallen away from us and ended up winning the race this way.
First one, first of many.
It's a good one. It's a good one. A lot of good examples in here. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned a little bit about how we define what we're going to do for race strategy, and we'll see you next time.